Noah and Kate. Chapter 19. The night was warm and a little humid, but a cool breeze swept over the lake now and then and tickled Kate's skin. It was a perfect summer evening, crickets chirping lazily in the trees and stars winking in the blackness above. Boats bobbed out on the lake, and distant voices floated on the air to a faint backdrop of music. Unlike the din of daytime lake parties, the sounds made the night feel somehow cozy and relaxed. Noah kept pace beside her as the gravel crunched beneath their feet, veering close to her every so often, his hand brushing against hers. She let her hand slip into his when it felt right, and they walked on in companionable silence, joined by their loosely entwined fingers and the unspoken words they both wanted to say. "Such a beautiful night," Kate said after a while, looking around. The lake glittered in the moonlight, and on the opposite shore, her cabin was among the points of light dotting the hillside. "It is," he agreed. He squeezed her hand a little, and she turned to look at him. He wore a saucy little grin that made her grin too. "You want to go down to the lake for a bit? Seems a shame to go home on a night like this." "Sure," she said, a warm, fluttery feeling dancing through her. "Sounds nice." He looked up and gestured to a sandy path that led off the road. "Come on, through here. I know a spot." He led her down the sloping path, past protesting branches that snapped and whapped in their faces at being disturbed. She laughed as she spit out a leaf and pulled a few more from her hair. "Great spots aren't easy to get to," Noah laughed, brushing a twig from his own hair. They emerged onto the beach, into a little sheltered area bounded on one side by a fallen tree, and on the other by a section of land that jutted out and dropped off steeply. It was like a private cove, like something she'd only ever seen in movies set in Europe or California or somewhere other than this quiet little lake. "I never knew this was here," she said, marveling. "This is gorgeous." "Me neither. I had a call here a few months ago. A dog walker broke her ankle." "You must have had a tough time getting her out," Kate mused as they picked their way down the slope. He laughed. "I just carried her out over my shoulder." She warmed at this idea, imagining his strong shoulders bearing the woman through the trees to the ambulance. She imagined how comforted the woman must have felt, how cared for and safe. Was it crazy to envy a woman who had broken her ankle? Maybe not so much. Noah began to unbutton his shirt, and Kate was yanked back to jarring reality. Well, now this was sudden, she thought, mildly alarmed. It didn't seem like him to just leap right into it without any, "I'm just giving us something to sit on," he said, obviously reading her expression. He grinned. "Unless you want to donate yours. I don't mind one bit." She laughed. "No, go on, be gallant. I don't mind one bit." His grin broadened and he pulled off his shirt, his well-developed shoulder muscles glowing in the soft moonlight. He flourished his shirt like a cape and laid it down on the sand, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Why, thank you, sir," she said. She wanted to make a joke about Walter Raleigh, who'd famously covered a puddle with his cape so that Queen Elizabeth could daintily step across it without muddying her little feet, but thought better of it. She was such a nerd about things like this, she didn't know for sure Noah would know what she was talking about. "Sir Raleigh, at your service, your majesty," he said, bowing graciously. Okay, so she could nerd out on him in future. Good to know. His shirt was still warm from his body heat. It felt comforting and intimate beneath her, and she wanted to stretch out and luxuriate on it like a cat. He could always take off his pants if he wanted something to sit on, she reasoned. And Janie Mac, he did. She laughed as he hopped on one foot and stepped out of his pants, laying them down on the sand beside her. He stood before her, wearing only black briefs and black socks. The socks, she thought, melting inside a bit. The briefs made him a Greek god. The socks made him adorable. It was a lethal combination. He sat down beside her, stretching out his long legs as she stretched out her considerably shorter ones. She felt overdressed in her t-shirt and capris, but wasn't quite ready to strip down with abandon like he obviously could. "You're really comfortable being undressed, aren't you?" she teased him. Her mind drifted back to the morning after their birthday and his resplendent, unabashed nudity as he plunged into the lake. He shrugged. "Always have been. My mom never could keep clothes on me. I'd run around the house naked all the time, especially when she had company over." "That sounds impossibly adorable," she said. He sighed grandly. "Yeah, those were the days. I was much younger then, of course." "How old were you?" 25. Kate let out a startled laugh. She leaned into him as she laughed, brushing against his solid wall of muscle, which didn't even move. "Oh, God, I walked right into that one," she said. He laughed, too, looking at her with a delighted expression. It was as if he'd never made a woman laugh before, and he couldn't quite believe he was doing it now. When her laughter died away, leaving her feeling buoyant and happy, she gazed up at him, caught by the glint of moonlight in his eyes. "You were great tonight," she said. "Keeping that class in line couldn't have been easy." His eyes widened comically. "I had no idea how unruly a bunch of little old ladies could be." His expression softened. "But they're great, really. It was a lot of fun, despite not really getting anywhere. At least now they know how to call 911 properly. I think. And they know how to do the head tilt and the breaths. That's something." He shuddered. "I pity the person they try to help, frankly. Did you see that pair in the corner? They were blowing raspberries up the dummy's nose." They both laughed, and Kate let her head drop comfortably onto Noah's shoulder. "If you do another class or two, they'll figure it out. You're a great teacher." She felt his lips on her head, a gentle kiss of thanks. Then she felt him move beneath her, and she lifted her head. He turned himself and braced his arm behind them on the sand, angling his body closer to hers. Then he leaned toward her and brushed her lips with his. Just one sweet, soft kiss that lingered. He pulled back and then kissed her again, and again. Gentle, sensual kisses that made her melt into him, responding to each kiss, kissing him back just as gently. There was no urgency in his kiss, but she felt the heat just the same, beginning low down in her belly and spreading out like a warm glow right down to her toes. Everything about him, from the gentle sweetness of his lips to the faint scent of something clean and masculine that tickled her nose, everything was just so right. When he looked at her, the breeze ruffling his hair and the moon shining in his eyes, he felt an almost overwhelming urge to pull him down on top of her. And yet, that thought scared her too. She wasn't afraid of him, and she wasn't afraid of sex. She was afraid of it ending, she realized with a pang. She was afraid of losing these wonderful moments, these tender moments between them, gingerly navigated, carefully explored. She was afraid that once they had sex, the magic would be over. It had always been that way for her, and she flashed on a painful memory of Lloyd McGill, transforming from someone who had looked at her the way Noah was looking at her now, into someone who couldn't get away from her fast enough. She didn't think Noah would treat her that way, but fear was irrational and deep, emotional and raw and hard to overcome with reason alone. Even if he stayed, even if he still wanted to see her, this breathless anticipation would be gone, and she didn't want it to end so soon. "I've never been skinny dipping," she finally said, swallowing against a lump in her throat. She could hardly believe what she was saying. "You want to join me?" He laughed softly. "I'm serious," she said, glancing over at the rippling lake, at the boats in the distance full of people having fun, enjoying the summer night, so carefree and easy. She looked back at him. "Come on, what do you say?" "I say I'll take any chance to see you naked," he said, waggling his eyebrows. Before he could lift his hips and slide out of his briefs, She was up on her feet and lifting her t-shirt over her head, flinging it down on the sand and reaching around for the hooks on her bra. She turned around to shield herself from his gaze, feeling unaccountably shy in spite of what they were about to do, and slid out of her capris and panties. She kicked off her sandals and stood for a moment, shivering a little as the night air whispered over her in unfamiliar places. Hearing Noah rising behind her, she braced herself for the coldness of the lake and scampered down the slope and into the water. She gasped as the cold water hit her skin, but she plunged on, striding further in until she felt the sand give way beneath her feet. She held her breath and dove forward, slipping beneath the surface and shrieking inwardly against the cold assault. She surfaced with a cry and began to tread water, swirls of colder currents enveloping her legs and her waist. Within seconds, though, she realized the lake wasn't as cold as it had been when Noah had tossed her into it. It had warmed up beneath the hot, sunny days of the past week, and although she wouldn't call it exactly comfortable, she didn't feel like she might die of hypothermia any moment. Noah was striding into the water at the shoreline, naked and beautiful in the moonlight. He was grinning, his eyes fixed on her, delight and surprise mingling on his face. He dove in and surfaced next to her, flicking his head to clear his hair from his eyes. Water splashed over her and she shrieked outwardly this time, slapping the water back at him in retaliation. He laughed and ducked away from the attack, and then submerged again, only to bob up on the other side of her, splashing her again. She cried out and treaded away from him, hoping to get her feet buoyant enough to kick a few good splashes at him. She soon learned just how difficult it was to run away from someone in water. He reached for her, laughing as he caught her, and pulled her to him. "Don't dunk me, don't you dare!" she giggled, letting herself be pulled back by him, enjoying the weightless feeling of her limbs drifting beneath the surface. "Would I do that?" "You did do that!" She swatted him, droplets spraying them both. "Okay, but would I do it again?" "Of course you would!" She laughed. "You're even naked again." "Yeah, and this time so are you," he said, and winked. He pulled her closer to him. "I much prefer this version, I have to say." Their bodies drifted together beneath the surface, tangling like strands of silk. It was so easy to wrap her legs around his waist, and then wrap her arms around his neck. He spread his hands across her back and moved them backwards a bit, and she realized he was standing. He was tall enough that he could stand on the lake bottom here, and the extra stability made her feel safe and protected, and yet, somehow, free. She felt something else, too. He was growing harder beneath her, and she wiggled a little to press herself against him, feeling his groan more than hearing it. He kissed her, playfully, his mouth now colder and certainly wetter than before. She kissed him back slowly, letting her lips taste his, feeling him respond. She parted her lips and deepened the kiss, slipping her tongue into his mouth to find his, reveling in the silky warmth. Kissing him was such sweet, easy pleasure. She could just close her eyes and get lost in the sensations, her hands on his shoulders, her legs encircling his waist. Every touch still felt new and breathless, every brush of his lips against hers a fresh thrill of pleasure. She never wanted it to end. Somehow, though, breaking the kiss made it go on longer, the pull between them lingering in the air, their faces so close and yet just separate enough to make the urge stronger, the desire deeper. And as much as she wanted to feel his mouth on hers again, she wanted this delicious tension more. She hoped, almost stupidly, that he wanted it too. Opposite needs swirled through her as she met his eyes. The need to kiss him, and the need to want to kiss him, the need to sink down onto him until he filled her, and the need to draw it out, to make it into something more, something poignantly, urgently more. She met his eyes, limned in the moonlight, shadows and points of light dancing, and waited, not even knowing what she was waiting for. If she were able to put words to the breathless need that pulsed through her with every heartbeat, they would be Show me you feel it too. Any other guy would be on her again, lips and tongue devouring, fingers digging into her flesh, hard insistence between his legs. Part of her wanted that too, so incredibly much it almost hurt. But there was more, there was just so much more. She could feel it. It wasn't just physical pleasure. It wasn't just an ageless choreography of touch and taste and feral urges driving bodies together until the tension combusted. It wasn't just a random female body and a random male body. It wasn't just hormones and drives and going through the motions to reach a few seconds of physical bliss. It could be so much more. His eyes roamed down to her lips, and her insides knotted, waiting for the crush of his mouth on hers, wanting it but not wanting it, powerless against both conflicting needs. He didn't kiss her. He reached up and smoothed a strand of wet hair away from her face and tucked it behind her ear. You know, I think you were right earlier, he said, low and sexy, his eyes appraising her. She almost couldn't speak. Her heart pounded. I think maybe my caveman side was a little... He searched for the word. She felt like he knew exactly what he wanted to say, but was looking for a coy way to say it. Finally, he leaned in closer to her and lowered his voice to an even richer, sultrier murmur. In a tizzy. Now she didn't know what to say. She could be coquettish and teasing and drag more reluctant confessions out of him. She could pretend she didn't know what he could possibly mean, batting her eyelashes, of course. Or she could let out a bashful little laugh, the verbal equivalent of a blush, and lower her eyes. She had so little experience with this. She didn't want to ruin it all by saying something to spoil the moment. Because he hadn't said, look, I was jealous of Sean, I admit it. I like you, and I don't want anyone to take you away from me. He was playing it coy, joking around even, evoking the caveman quip. And part of her appreciated this dancing around, in a way she couldn't even explain. Was she supposed to say, so show me that caveman side like you promised, big boy? Was that the proper response? Would Lily Graham be all over this, knowing exactly how to flirt and tease and let him know it was all systems go? Why him? She finally said, and flinched. She cursed inwardly, but pushed on. I mean, you didn't feel tizzied up over Evan or that first guy at Room for Dessert. Why was she doing this? Just kiss him, you idiot, she heard her inner nympho cry. A hint of a shrug. Those guys weren't much competition, I guess. Besides, you want to get serious with guys like them. With a guy like Sean, well, if you're looking for some fun with a handsome paramedic... He trailed off, as if expecting her to finish the sentence, as if it was obvious. If you're looking for a no-strings-attached fling, one stud in uniform is as good as any other. She almost started to cry. This is why you don't expect more, she chastised herself. This fantasy you have, this delusion you have, that there's something special going on, that the guy, whoever he is, wants you, needs you, feels a connection with you. It's just that, a fantasy. No, I wasn't jealous of Sean because he had feelings for her. He was worried about losing out on some stress-free summer sex, losing out to someone he actually believed she could go off with instead, as if it didn't matter who it was, as if muscles and a handsome smile were the only cost of admission. The way a nice pair of boobs and a pretty face on anyone else might suit him just fine, too. What, Katie May, what did I say? He asked then, softly, apparently seeing something in her expression. She closed her eyes and shook her head. Nothing. It's nothing. I said something to upset you. Tell me, please. She smiled at him. I shouldn't have talked about being jealous of anyone. I'm sorry, he said. It's not fair. I have no right to interfere with your love life. You are my love life. You have every right. No, I just don't want you to think... She hesitated. Now she was looking for a better way to say what she wanted to say. I'm not interested in Sean. Or anyone else, she finally said. And I wouldn't do this with just anyone. She hoped he understood. She hoped she didn't have to elaborate, because she had a feeling if she began to talk about this, she'd end up saying a whole lot of things she'd wish she could reel back in later. Me neither, he said. You know that, right? She nodded. She felt a lump in her throat the size of a baseball and hoped she'd be able to talk past it. Of course he wouldn't do this with just anyone, her heart whispered to her. He'd need to find someone who only wanted casual sex for a few weeks. She didn't doubt there were lots of women who'd happily sign up for that, especially with someone as toe-curlingly good-looking as Noah, but there weren't that many of them around here right now. Proximity was probably more of an aphrodisiac than anything else. If she had nothing else going for her, at least she had that. The water lapped around them gently, and the night air against her wet skin gave her goose pimples. She desperately wished she had just kissed him. She wished she could be as free and easy as he was. She wished she could joke and tease and be suggestive without trying to elicit from him more than he felt. He didn't deserve it, and her ravaged heart couldn't take it. Because you've said some things lately, he said, his brow furrowing. Like, sex doesn't mean anything to me. Or, I don't care who I'm with. I know. I'm sorry I said that. No, it's okay, he said. I just hope you understand. I hope you don't have the wrong idea about me. She wanted to stop this. She wished more than anything she could take back this entire conversation, rewind it like an old VHS tape, and go back to the spot where he'd suggestively mentioned the caveman bit. She'd give anything not to be having this uncomfortable conversation out here in the lake, naked, bathed in moonlight, owing it to herself to just enjoy the moment. Because she knew the next words out of his mouth were going to be something about how he was a lone wolf and wouldn't ever settle down with one woman. Okay, maybe he wouldn't say something as eye-rolling as lone wolf, but it would be along those lines. It was the grown-up equivalent of the middle school burn, I only like you as a friend. It was, I only like you as a friend, ... that I have sex with once in a while. And she was done with hearing these things from men. She never wanted to see a guy squirm ever again. She never wanted to watch the walls go up, the excuses come out, the emotional defense system ratchet up in alarm. And she didn't want to put him in a position of having to do it. For the first time ever, she'd gone into a relationship, or whatever this was, knowing it would only ever be about sex. She couldn't blame him now for wanting her to honor it. He'd been honest and tender and sweet about everything. She couldn't very well move the goalposts, or secretly hope he'd move them himself. I just can't get serious right now, he went on, and she cringed inside. I know. It breaks my heart in pieces, that's how much I know. Can't, he repeated. Don't want to. You get that, right? I absolutely do. She found her voice. I absolutely don't. You could stay if you wanted to. We could make it work. Oh, stop it, Malone. Just stop it. You don't want him giving up something he loves just to be with you. He smiled faintly, cautiously hopeful, his head bobbing gently in the water as he treaded beneath it. Okay, then. Good. I'm glad. So how about, she said, drawing out her words and trying to lighten the mood, we not talk about heavy stuff and just enjoy this beautiful night? He smiled, although his eyes still looked a little wary. Okay by me. She pulled away from him and drifted through the water on her back, lifting her arms out of the water in a gentle backstroke, gazing up at the stars dotting the inky sky. She found the moon, glowing ghostly white and fragile in all that darkness. Behind her, the lights of the boats and the cottages on the hill hazed into dabs of orange and red, like an impressionist painting. She breathed in the cool night air, filling her lungs and feeling her anxiety float out of her and into the gentle waves. Noah swam up beside her, and she laughed when she saw him as just a disembodied head bobbing along the surface, realizing she must look the same to him. She treaded towards him, fitting her arms and legs around him easily. His hands went around her again, beneath the wispy strands of her hair as it drifted weightlessly behind her. "This is so nice," she said, even though she was beginning to shiver a little. "Thank you for this." "Me?" he laughed. "It wasn't my idea, Malone." "I know, but there's no way I would have done this if you weren't here. So thank you." "Anytime I can help you take your clothes off, just holler," he said. His grin was so playful, so bright and boyish and fun, she found it impossible not to smile when he did. She began to shiver more noticeably now, her jaw wobbling a bit all on its own. His eyes grew more serious, and he held her to him more firmly. "I think we should get you out. You're getting cold," he said. "But it's so nice," she pleaded. Her wobbling jaw proved his point for him. He began to move towards the shore, his stride steadying when his feet reached bottom and he was able to walk. She held on to him, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck and her ankles crossed behind his waist, and expected to be put down when they reached the beach. But he only held on tighter, carrying her up the slope to where they had abandoned their clothes. She was shivering thoroughly now, and when he finally set her on her feet, she hugged herself in a lame effort to warm up. He scooped her shirt off the ground, shook loose some sand, and began to dry her off, using it as a towel. "Hey, I'm going to have to put that on," she protested, through chattering teeth. "It'll get all wet." "You need to dry off first," he said, sweeping her shirt all over her body. She had to admit she felt a lot better once the water was whisked off her skin. His strong hand running all over her wasn't bad either. When he was done drying her whole body, even each of her calves, he draped her shirt over his shoulder and reached for his uniform shirt. He shook the sand from it too, and then swung it around her shoulders, gesturing for her to guide her own arms into it. It was miles too big on her, but it was warm and dry and smelt like him. He wrapped each flap of the shirt over her chest, layering one side over the other and not even bothering to try buttoning it up. "There, how's that?" he asked, surveying his handiwork. "Feel better?" "Much," she said, her jaw happily wobble-free. She frowned. "But what about you? What are you going to wear?" He waved the idea away. "I'm fine. I'm a polar bear, remember?" She laughed, flashing on an image of he and Callum and Lily's boyfriend leaping into the lake in the all-together. She couldn't honestly picture what Callum and Carl had looked like. She'd only been able to focus on the tall, gorgeous blonde one, the one who was naked again at this same lake, the one she'd happily gone into the water with. This time, at least. "Here's your bottoms," he said, reaching down for her capris and offering them to her. She took them gratefully and pulled them up over her hips, and watched as he retrieved his uniform pants and stepped into them. She discreetly tucked her bra into her capri pocket. In a moment, they had their shoes back on, and Noah reached for her hand. "Come on, let's get you home." Kate let him lead her through the thicket of trees, grateful when he reached back to hold a branch aside so it wouldn't whack her on the face when she went through. When they emerged back out onto the gravel road, she clasped his hand more firmly, a silent, hopeful message to him that she didn't want him to let go. They walked on in easy silence, and every once in a while he'd look over at her with a strange half-smile on his face. She waited for him to explain, but when he didn't, she finally spoke. "What?" she asked. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" She expected him to say something about how now he had even more blackmail material against her, if the need ever arose. The proper Ms. Kate Malone, skinny dipping in broad moonlight. Or maybe something about how much she weighed, and how it had been an effort for him to carry her out of the water. She braced herself, knowing that male attempts at humor could often sting. "You look so cute in my shirt," he finally said. She let out a breath. "I mean, it's way too big on you, but it's adorable." "Thanks," she said. What else could she say? "You sure you don't want it back now?" "Nah, I like it much better on you." She glanced at his naked chest and had to admit she agreed. She much preferred it on herself than on him. He had dried off, and the warm, smooth glow of his skin had re-emerged, even without the light of the sun. Her top was still draped casually over his shoulder, but beneath it she could still make out the contours of his well-developed shoulders. She stole glances at him, somehow feeling too self-conscious to just outright stare. He was so nice to look at, as Luna had coquettishly said. So very nice to touch, too. She could almost feel the ridges of muscles beneath her hands. "What are you looking at?" he asked playfully, catching her in mid-ogle. "You," she said frankly, and then lost her resolve and looked away. "You know you're gorgeous. You must hear it all the time." She felt his hand squeeze hers a little, and she looked over at him. "I like hearing it from you," he said. There was so much she could have said right then. She could have launched into a filibuster of praise and admiration, going over every inch of him in detail, describing how each part of him made her flutter inside, how his broad shoulders and rounded delts made her body sing with awareness every time she saw them, how his biceps thrilled her, how the solid wall of his chest made her want to drag her lips across it and taste every inch. And this was only above the waist. But she held back, not even sure why. He would love to hear it, and she would love to let go and just spill it all out, but it would be a kind of admission she wasn't sure she was ready to make yet. It would show him how badly she wanted him. It would give him a kind of kryptonite over her defenses. Maybe it was too late. Maybe he already knew perfectly well how much she lusted for him. But if she stopped him here on the road beneath the glowing moon and told him he did things to her no man had ever done, made her want things she never knew she wanted, well, she just couldn't. Because he wasn't hers. And somehow that made all the difference. What point in there was telling a man how much you wanted him, when both of you knew he wasn't yours to have? They reached the cabin, and Kate felt a tightness in her chest as they mounted the stairs to the porch. Should she invite him in? Was he expecting her to? Would she be disappointing him if she just said goodnight? Did she even want to just say goodnight? Just outside the door, she realized he hadn't followed her up the stairs. She turned to look and saw he had stopped at the bottom step, his hand on the rail, his other hand in the pocket of his uniform pants. Her breath caught again at the sight of him, at the incongruity of his bare chest above and his official work pants below. Somehow it was ridiculously sexy. Do you want to come in?" she asked uncertainly, hating how unsure she sounded. It didn't sound like a genuine invitation, because she wasn't quite sure that it was. He smiled at her. "I think I should check in at the station," he said, draping her wet shirt onto the railing. "I am still, technically, on call." "Oh, right, of course," she said, nodding. On call hadn't meant he couldn't go skinny dipping, or go to sleep, or do other things in bed. But clearly he didn't want to, and it was probably because he was scared of giving her mixed messages. Her face burned with embarrassment, and she hoped he couldn't see how red she felt. "Well, again, thanks for everything tonight. You were amazing." "Thanks," he said again. He paused, like he was waiting for something, and then finally said, "Aren't you forgetting something?" Her heart did a little flip. She went down a couple of steps until she was eye level with him, an unusual experience for her. It allowed her to wrap her arms around his neck and lower her lips to his. His lips were warm and soft, and he kissed her back with an easy, sultry slowness. She let her fingers drift into his hair and down his neck as they kissed. But when she didn't feel his hands reaching for her, she reluctantly let him go. "Well, that was delicious," he said. "But I was referring to this." He ran his finger down the center of her chest, a tantalizing line right between her breasts. "Oh?" she breathed. "My shirt?" he prompted gently. She froze, and all thoughts of a sexy interlude vanished as she let out an embarrassed laugh. Oh my God, I'm sorry, she said. He laughed and started to tell her it was okay, he was only joking, but without thinking she quickly shrugged each arm out of it and handed it to him. It took her another moment to fully realize she was now topless. His eyes widened, and then he flushed with pleasure, glancing down at her chest and looking back up at her with a wide grin. Wow, you've come a long way, Miss Malone. I'll make you a polar bear yet. She grabbed her shirt off the railing and held it to her chest, playing pretend at modesty, even though she'd just gone skinny dipping with him. It seemed a bit too much like an invitation to stand there topless in front of him, even though he was doing the same thing with her. I wouldn't go that far, she said, but I definitely enjoyed letting loose a little. Like I said, I'm more than happy to help, he said. Anytime you need, just ask. A thought occurred to her, and she frowned a little, wondering if she should indeed ask him what had been on her mind since this morning. He was looking at her so openly, so sweetly, and she did feel so safe with him. Can I ask a favor? She asked. It might sound weird, but I could use your help with something. Anything, he said. She bit her lip. It's more of a friend favor, if you know what I mean. He shrugged lightly. I'm your friend. What is it? I told you about that blind date thing that the site offers, she said, hesitating as she saw him stiffen a little. I'm meeting up with someone tomorrow night at 9 at that new restaurant outside Dunmore, you know the one? But I don't know anything about him. I haven't seen his profile. I just know he's called James, but that's it. You want me to be lookout? Do you mind? I hate to ask, but I admit it, I'm doubtful about this one. You were so great with Evan. I'd feel better knowing you were around if things go wrong. I'll be there, he said. I'll hang around in the parking lot. You can text me if you need me. She smiled, relieved. Thank you so much. I'll feel much better knowing you're there. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes large and dark and yet still so expressive. They were still so close. She could so easily whisper against his ear that she wanted him to come inside. That simple gesture would reassure him, probably. She was going on a date tomorrow, but tonight, with him, would be as meaningless and tangle-free as he preferred. Well, good night then, she said after a few awkward minutes. And thanks again for everything. My pleasure, he said, his eyes still fixed on hers. A slight frown spread across his face, and he lowered his head, almost as if he didn't want her to see it. I'll see you tomorrow, Katie May. He turned then and left, pausing at the crest of the driveway to throw her a casual wave before disappearing back down the road. Noah walked down the gravel road, glancing back at the cabin a few times, pausing to watch when the upstairs light blinked on. He waited to see if he could catch her vague silhouette, or if the light would dim and shift as she moved about the room. But the light remained steady and warm, a single rectangle glowing in the night, until it winked out, and only the moon and stars brightened his path home. He could be with her, right now. If he hadn't been such an idiot, if he hadn't brought up friggin' Sean Wainwright and the caveman thing, if it hadn't snowballed, no, avalanched, into that scrotum-clenching discussion about what sex between them would mean, if he hadn't spoiled their perfect night and allowed all that crap to loom up between them and ruin the moment, he could be in that big soft bed with her right now. It had been clumsy and lame and something he'd never thought he'd do, basically fishing for reassurance, hoping to find out if Kate's head might be turned by someone else. Why did it even matter? She was actively dating men to find a husband, for God's sake. Why on earth should it matter to him if she went out with Sean, too? This was supposedly a friends with benefits thing, right? What right did he have to stick his nose in and stop her from friends with benefiting with someone else, too? Because just the thought of it made him want to puke. Just the thought of another guy's hands on her, of her wrapping her arms around someone else and kissing him. He shook the image away. It was stupid to think this way. Of course there would be other guys in her life. If not now, then certainly soon. Guys who would make her laugh, guys who would look out for her, guys who would see and feel and taste her. Damn it, Kincaid, enough! Maybe it was just the idea of her hooking up with Sean, he reasoned with himself. A guy he knew would end up hurting her, a guy she absolutely couldn't trust. Maybe if she found a decent guy, someone who would treat her right, respect her, love her, maybe even marry her. But she'd stumped him there too, asking why going on her dates didn't bother him. Because they did. He ran his hand through his hair as he walked and blew out a long, frustrated breath. Everything about this dating site bothered him. Everything about this whole damn situation bothered him. Every guy who cast his eyes over her as his potential wife made Noah's blood boil. Assessing her looks, comparing her to their exes, using her as a substitute for the woman they really wanted. Not to mention the guy who wanted a replacement mother for his kids. It was like some kind of bizarre meat market or a catalog site for picking out a good little woman. That damn site attracted guys with serious issues. None of them had been able to see the smart, sexy, funny woman in front of them. Not one of them deserved even a few moments of her time or attention. The trouble was, neither did he. He tilted his head back as he walked, letting out another frustrated breath.
I think maybe my caveman side wasn't a tizzy,
he mimicked himself in a whiny voice.
Gee, Kate, won't you make me feel better? Tell me you don't want that guy. Tell me you only want me, please? But don't forget, I'm blowing town soon, so, keep it light, baby.
Jesus, he was an idiot. An idiot who had to be there for yet another one of those damn dates tomorrow, too. He picked up his pace and began to jog, hoping that some exercise might clear his mind and relieve the awful, nauseous feeling in the pit of his stomach. Running felt natural and right, and he eased into a steady pace down the hill towards town, focusing on his feet as they pounded out a rhythm on the gravel beneath him. He felt his phone vibrating in his back pocket, and he slowed down, excitement surging through him as he fished it out. Maybe it was her, texting him to come back to the cabin. He closed his eyes. Please let it be her. Please. He steadied his breath and looked down at the screen. The green text notification bubble popped up, showing a number he didn't recognize along the top. Hi, Mr. Kincaid. This is Sandra from Global Medic. We're so looking forward to meeting you. We've had one of our volunteers drop out of a project in Honduras. It's a vaccination program in the most remote part of the country, and we'd love to get it done before we start the Panama project. I was just wondering if you'd be able to move your trip up by a couple of weeks and join us a bit early? He stared at the screen, his heart still pounding from his run, or maybe from something else. He read the text again and again. Another bubble popped up. Sorry for such short notice, but if you could make it down this week, preferably by Wednesday the 20th, if possible, it would be a big help. We have 90% of the territory fully vaccinated. We just need a little extra help to get us all the way there. Can we count on you? He stood for a moment, just staring at the screen. Images flashed through his mind, familiar images he'd built up ever since he'd signed on with Global Medic. Arriving at a small airport in the sweltering sun, greeting his new contacts, meeting the other volunteers at the base. A vaccination program in the remote mountains of Honduras sounded incredible, something he'd pictured himself doing for years now. And he could start now. He had already reduced his shifts at the station in preparation for his departure. He knew Emma and the others could cover another couple of weeks if he wanted to go now. He could go now. Now. This craziness with Kate would come to a natural end before it got out of control. They hadn't even really done anything yet. They just sort of fooled around a bit, nothing too serious. He could stop it from ever getting heavy and leave their friendship still in a good place. He could leave, like he knew he had to. He could do it now without too much pain, like ripping a Band-Aid off instead of peeling it off torturously slowly. He could leave Kate right now and never look back. He paused, his thumbs trembling as they hovered over the keys on the screen. He took a deep breath and typed his reply.